Thank you for joining CIE's weekly analysis of the Hamas-Israel war, Israel's 9/11, with the best analysts, scholars, clergy, journalists, practitioners, and diplomats that we can assemble from around the world. I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and an Emory University emeritus professor of Middle Eastern history, political science, and Israel studies. Our 25 prior webinars are archived on our website, israeled.org. There are audio and video versions for each webinar. Some 12,000 individuals have used or listened to these past webinars. Join our Israel learning community, if you will. Visit israeled.org. We provide crisp analyses about Israel, Zionism, its culture and society, and we definitely stay away from polemics. We've been doing this for 15 years. And if you like what you see on the website, or if you enjoy today's webinar and past ones, please do donate to our work. Since Hamas brutally murdered 1,200 Israelis and others and kidnapped more than 240 on October 7, reactions across the world have been mixed, and they have not been static, but are changing, including today. To discuss Europe, Israel, and the Middle East, the war in the last 6 months, we're fortunate today to have three distinguished guests. Joan Ryan, the executive director of the British wing of European Leadership Network, ELNET, initiated by both European and American individuals who are deeply passionate about Israel and its relationship with Europe. ELNET seeks to align Europe and Israel and the US around common strategic interests. Professor Emeritus, renowned scholar Colin Shindler, a colleague at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, prolific author, and founding chairman of the European Israel Studies Association. Raouf Leeraar, Israel and Middle East Policy Advisor to the Netherlands Center for Information and Documentation on Israel, and a public intellectual frequently asked to address audiences about Israel and the Middle East. Raouf is also an IDF veteran. Europe, of course, has had a major impact on the region's geopolitics for at least the last 150 years, ever since the British landed in Egypt and took over the Suez Canal in the early 1880s. And the French remained ruling to one degree or another in North Africa from 1830 through 1962. Europe played a role in shaping the borders of the Middle East, and the European Jewish experience during World War II had an impact on Zionism state building. The British controlled Palestine for 3 decades until 1948, and European powers provided economic and military assistance to Middle Eastern states from the 1950s forward. Europe became at one point Israel's largest trading partner, and European countries have been highly sensitive to Middle Eastern politics and access to Middle Eastern oil, a factor that influenced Europe collectively not to support Israel during the 1973 war. In 1991, Madrid hosted a peace conference aimed at bringing Palestinians and Israelis together. It directly influenced the private PLO-Israeli discussions that followed. In the last month, we've learned that Europe and the United States collectively are trying to keep open the Middle Eastern waterways, the Red Sea, and prevent them from being blockaded by Iran or its proxies. Joan, would you give us, please, a snapshot of European outlooks toward Israel as you've seen them evolve before October 7th and after?
As Ken said, I'm the CEO of ELNET UK, and ELNET's mission is to strengthen relations between Europe and Israel based on shared democratic values and strategic interests. And the shared democratic values is key to what we do. We exist right across Europe. It's a unique selling point. We're pan-European and we're completely bipartisan. If we think back a little way to just over 3 years, 3.5 years, and the Abraham Accords was, I think, a moment of light that came as a surprise to many. Those who were closer to it were anticipating that something was going to happen. And we celebrated its first year and we celebrated its second year, and we didn't do very much on its third year, October, November, because of what had happened on October the 7th. And that moment of light, some feel, has dimmed. But I am more positive than that, because I think all those countries who signed up and others who wanted to. Whatever they've said publicly as the Israel-Hamas war has followed its course, none of them have actually broken off talking to Israel diplomatically or behind the scenes. I think that is a very positive sign. Interestingly, when the tragedy and the horror of October the 7th happened, we saw a very unusual move. France, Germany, Italy, the UK made a joint statement of steadfast and united support for the state of Israel and condemned Hamas. Now, we've had a lot of ups and downs since then. In terms of the UK, only yesterday, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, made it very clear that Israel remains a key ally of the UK and the UK a key ally of Israel. And he also made it very clear that despite the calls to stop selling any arms to Israel, not that we sell very many arms at all to Israel, but despite the calls to stop exporting arms to Israel and to cancel arms licenses, he's not going to do that, that isn't the right thing to do because we're their ally. But of course, that kind of in a way at the moment would be not very important to anybody given the amount of arms we sell. It's the symbolic nature of trying to get a snowball rolling downhill, getting bigger and bigger and bigger as more and more countries make a statement of we won't give them arms, an attempt to isolate and marginalize them, because of course 68% of the foreign sourced weapons that Israel have come from America and 30% from Germany. It's less than 1% from the UK. So much of what is said in public domain, in the political forums that are not necessarily government speaking, but members of parliament or members who are not friends of Israel, much of what is said is symbolic about their attitude towards Israel. What we have seen in the UK and right across Europe is a huge seismic rise in anti-Semitism. In the UK alone, this is somewhere around a 54% increase. And it was almost immediate, this seismic increase in anti-Semitism, and some of it associated with violent attacks that we've not seen for a long time. And I know that is true in other European capitals, and I know that has been true in the United States. How that will go back in the box, I don't know. That is a very worrying development, I have to say. The other thing I would mention is that we see now a polarization occurring, and it's becoming more and more defined where the support for Israel is and where it isn't. A lot of countries are facing elections this year. Certainly the UK, we're expecting one. It could be announced any time, but by the end of the year, we'll have an election. The USA, of course, will have an election in November. The European Union has an election. Candidate lists are up and things like that. So that's happening. This is right down the middle of what's happening amongst parliaments around the world. They're playing to these politics. There's two things happening in the British Parliament. It is true that many parliamentarians are frightened. Their offices have been attacked, they've been painted with Hamas slogans and flags. There's been huge marches in many European capitals. So there's this scare, there's this worry about the impact on the vote in marginal seats in particular, that is making MPs who would normally be very supportive of Israel want to say there should be a ceasefire, and they don't necessarily link it to the release of hostages. What I would say about the UK and some other countries, but certainly the UK, it's been remarkable how the government and the official opposition, the Labour Party, have not allowed this to become a wedge issue between them. In recent weeks, they've expressed different tone, maybe around wanting to see the legal advice the government won't release and wanting to consider ceasing to sell arms if the legal advice says the international humanitarian law as it applies in war has been breached. But at the end of the day, both parties have stayed on board, have not divided on a party political basis in any major way, and have not really sought to bring it to Parliament. Any debates that have been brought by the Scottish National Party, who generally are not as pro-Israeli as the other two main parties. I wouldn't say they're supportive of Hamas, I don't think they are, but they would be very much more supportive of the Palestinian cause. Now, I think for the whole Parliament and for all parties, everybody is committed to two states. There isn't anybody really who's arguing that there is any other real solution. And I think that's certainly true across the EU and the major European countries in which we're active: France, Germany, Italy, the Central and Eastern European countries, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Czech Republic. They all are committed to a two-state solution, and that's not changed either. The Israeli Prime Minister said the day before yesterday that there is a date set for going into Rafah, but he's not announced what that date is. How that happens, whether it happens, and if it does, how it happens, that could be a watershed moment.
The figures I have from the CST, which is like the security organization of the Jewish community, is that there was a 147% rise in 2023 over 2022 in terms of anti-Semitic incidents. And that went up to 161% increase in Greater London. So it's not a sort of mythology to say that anti-Semitism has increased, where anti-Zionism has tipped over into anti-Jewish incidents. There's a religious affairs program very early on Sunday mornings on the BBC, and they had a discussion about how the situation has affected different religious groups. And Ed Kessler, who runs the very admirable Wolf Institute in Oxford, which deals with dialogue between Jews, Christians, Muslims, and other faiths, said that in all his 35 years that he's been dealing with this, and indeed creating and building up the Wolf Institute, he's never known it so bad in terms of interfaith and intercommunal dialogue. That may give you an idea of the situation here. Now, although there's no overt violence, there is a sense of disdain, of distaste towards those who support Israel. And of course, the majority of them just happen to be Jews. There's been demonstrations every Saturday. It started off with several 100,000 people marching in the centre of London. That's decreased, but a majority of these people have been members of the Muslim community. And I would suggest that this is a way of asserting a Muslim identity. It's divorced in a strange way from the intricacies and the complexities of the Israel-Palestine conflict. For example, there's no protests outside the Chinese embassy in central London about the situation, the discrimination, the brainwashing of the Muslim Uyghurs in China. It's also interesting to note that the far left has been very active in these demonstrations and indeed trying to cultivate the Muslim community. In the 1990s, there was the start, mainly by the Socialist Workers' Party, which is a Trotskyist organization, to cultivate the Muslim community because they saw them as the new proletariat. Their attitude towards Hamas, if you read their literature, after the 7th of October, they all power to the resistance, as if these people were not killers and murderers. And it shows how distorted their understanding has been about the situation. If you go back to the foundation of Israel, you find that the Labour Party, the further left that you went, the more pro-Zionist they were. So, for example, the founder of the National Health Service here was Aneurin Bevan, and he threatened to resign from the Attlee government in 1947 over British conduct in Palestine. He and his wife, Jenny Lee, who was the founder of the Open University in this country, were very strongly pro-Israel. Now, what's interesting is that many Jews who are now living in Britain, in France, Holland, many other countries in Western Europe, and indeed the United States, were part of the great emigration after 1881 from Tsarist Russia. And what is also interesting, during the pogroms of 1881, 1882, the far left, the Narodnaya Volya, kept silent. They did not wish to annoy, to irritate a potential source of support. They wanted to turn the anger of the pogromists against the Tsar. So from 1881 to 2024, not too much has changed. The British government has been caught really between allowing free speech, which is perfectly fair. Many Muslims, many pro-Palestinians wish to have their view stated. There's no problem in that. There's the difference between that and intimidation of Jews, and it's a fine balance. So a few days ago, at the end of Ramadan, the mayor of London, is a Muslim, Sadiq Khan, called for the release of the hostages. Several rabbis were invited to a commemoration in Trafalgar Square. And in general, there's an attempt by some rabbis and some imams to try and rebuild the contacts that they had before the 7th of October. Now, just a final word about Europe. In Ireland and in Spain, there's been a long pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel approach before the 7th of October. And because I was involved with the European Association of Israel Studies, I went to Eastern Europe times to speak to academics and various people. I found that Western Europe was weighed down by the legacy of colonialism and indeed of slavery, whereas Eastern Europe had a slightly different history. And of course, Poles and Jews have a shared history. And I found that in Eastern Europe, I was very much welcomed. In Western Europe, I obviously utilized language which would be appropriate. So I think there is a difference between East and Western Europe. Although one of the workers that were killed during the Israeli airstrike was a Pole, and indeed Poland protested to Israel. The final thing I'd like to say is that the British government has banned the statement "Free Palestine" from the river to the sea because they regard it as incendiary. Some people regard it as anti-Semitic. But if you go from the river to the sea, it means a greater Palestine. It doesn't mean a two-state solution. It means a one-state solution. And if that means that there should not be any Jews there, that it should be Judenrein, then is that an anti-Semitic statement? I came across a conference that was held in 2021 in which Yahya Sinwar presided. What do you do once you've achieved victory and you've created a new Palestine? What do you do with the Jews? It was some remarkable, if bizarre comments about deporting them, killing them, letting them stay. So the statement "from the river to the sea, free Palestine," can mean different things. But for many Jews, it means a Judenrein Palestine, that the Jews are not wanted there.
Let me just ask a quick question about the British media. How have you found the reporting? Is there a distinction between reporting and editorial writing, or is one just blended in with the other?
That's a very good question, Ken. I could go on for hours. It's been superficial. It's been abbreviated. The BBC, who I always respected, there's been a program on from 6 o'clock in the morning to 9, news program on the radio. I've always listened to it. I just find it superficial and in some ways quite disgraceful. If you listen to the BBC, if you watch BBC television, and then if you go and listen to or read the Israeli press, they're two parallel universes. I accept that the killings of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza is hardly reported in the Israeli media, which I think is terrible. But you have to put the BBC and, I don't know, Haaretz or Channel 14 together to get the rounded picture. But I've been incredibly disappointed at the way things have been covered in England by the media.
I'd put it a bit stronger than Colin. I think they've been pretty dreadful overall, really dreadful. I think the BBC has been by far the worst. Anything that comes out from Hamas, who after all are a designated terror organization here and many places across Europe, they would take anything they said. They talk about the Hamas Health Authority that we know doesn't really exist. As when the hospital where they said 500 died, it turned out to be a dozen or so in the car park. No such thing had happened. It was a misfire of a Hamas rocket. The BBC reported it immediately. Now, it's all right coming back afterwards and saying, oh, we were wrong, that didn't happen. But it's already had its impact. It's already incited and whipped up and formed attitudes. And they've done that consistently. They've got one reporter called Jeremy Bowen who is so biased, so anti-Israel. And I don't think that's putting it too strongly, that I cannot understand how the BBC can defend themselves as a public sector broadcaster. Sky isn't always a lot better. ITN is a little better, but they too have reported things that have not happened or have not happened in the way that they're being reported. It's not just unhelpful, it is absolutely whipped up feeling against Israel in a very, very unfair manner. It's also unfair to the population. We pay for things like the BBC and we're entitled to a balanced view, but they are constantly holding Israel to a standard that no other democratic country is ever held to. No analysis was ever made of these issues in that way in Syria, in Iraq, the Uyghurs, as Colin says. And just before you move on, Colin, I agree with your figures on the rise in anti-Semitism. The figure I was quoting is a CST figure, and it's the increase since the 7th of October, and it's 59%. I think I lopped a few off. It's 59%. Yes, it's seismic, isn't it? October's 6 months ago, and there was a massive rise before that.
Someone just referred me a couple of days ago to the newspaper that's considered the place where all the news is fit to print. And someone told me, you mean the Gaza Times? And I smiled, but let it be. Raouf, you've been very patient. Please give us your understanding of what's going on in Holland.
Very interesting to hear the perspectives from Joan and Colin about everything that is happening in Great Britain. And unfortunately, I have to agree with them completely and say that the situation in the Netherlands is very similar. Looking at the media in the Netherlands, it's actually great, Joan, that you talked about the hospital example, because we had the exact same issue here in the Netherlands with the public broadcasting, which is called the NOS here in the Netherlands. And I was, of course, also following the Israeli news and the army news. And it was actually in the evening, I think 7 minutes to 7 p.m. when Palestinian media released the news item about the hospital being bombed. And it wasn't even 7 o'clock when the Dutch media literally copy and pasted the message from the Palestinian media without verification, without asking the Israelis, without conducting research whether these are facts or not. And the results of that have been that people in the 4 big cities here in the Netherlands, which compared to London are actually very small, but we call them big, people went out in the streets. People went demonstrating, people were angry, and even here in The Hague, people went to the Israeli embassy to protest. And this was fairly in the beginning of the war. And already at that stage, when I saw that, I thought the step from demonstrating while angry towards using violence, it is not a very big step. And this is what we have seen in the Netherlands, unfortunately. The rise of anti-Semitic incidents here has been very, very frightening. Yesterday, we published our yearly anti-Semitism monitor. In that monitor, we write down the amount of incidents, the nature of the incidents, the intensity, etc. And we concluded that we saw a 245% rise in 2023 as compared to 2022. And already before the 7th of October, we were touching upon the figures of December 2022. And then, of course, the 7th of October happened and everything exploded, as in other countries in Europe. We've seen a rabbi here in one of the big cities being hit on his head. We've had Jewish children leaving their schools because they are threatened with knives and with being killed. So it's really horrible. And the politics here in the parliament have in general been very supportive of the Jewish community at first, but that support for now remains only in words. And after publishing our monitor, and of course also in talks with the government and with parliament, we've really urged them to not only support us in words, but also with deeds, because the Jewish community here in the Netherlands needs protection. We see the amount of violent cases, physical violence, we see a rise. And the next question is, what will be the next step? Will the next step be that a Jewish person in the street will get killed? I do not deem it impossible. And that is extremely worrying. Further, I think what I can say about Parliament is that we just had elections in November. And following what both of you said, Colin and Joan, about the demonstrations, the protests here in the Netherlands, we actually see a similar pattern. It is a coalition between the far left and people from the Islamic community who find each other and show their aversion, hatred in some cases. And I think most of the time it is derived from not enough knowledge and also too much dependence on social media, which of course contains a lot of disinformation and a lot of very, very wrong stereotypes which are anti-Semitic in nature. I think these protests have contributed to a landslide win of the Party for Freedom here in the Netherlands, the PVV from Geert Wilders, who is actually controversial here in the Netherlands, of course, also from his anti-Islam viewpoints. At one of the protests, actually, protesters damaged a McDonald's because McDonald's also has eating possibilities in Israel. This shows how far the hatred actually goes. And after that incident, I think that the Party for Freedom of Geert Wilders actually won a lot more seats than everybody was expecting.
How many Jews are there in the Netherlands, and how has the Jewish community officially or unofficially reacted to this increase in incidents?
There are between 40 and 50,000 Jews in the Netherlands, most of whom live in Amsterdam. And the main reaction to anti-Semitism has been fear. People are very scared to go out in public to show their Star of David or their kippah if they wear it. There are a few organizations, of which we are one in the Netherlands, who are actually fighting against anti-Semitism and to try to paint at least a more honest picture of Israel. We have been on the front line now for many months, and that has also cost us sacrifices from our personal lives, because we are also being intimidated and threatened and all sorts of other horrible stuff happening. But I would say that the majority of the Jewish community here is very afraid, feels very alone. And that is why I always call to, let's say, the silent majority of the country, that it is time to step up and speak out against anti-Semitism.
Is there a notable willingness on the part of some folks in the Netherlands to immigrate as a result of this?
Yeah, I've heard already a couple of examples of families from Amsterdam that have actually moved to Israel. And then a lot of Dutch people say, well, why would you move to Israel? It's not safe there and it's not safe here. But I think you have either to be Israeli or maybe or Jewish or to be somewhat in that world to understand that sentiment, that emotion. But I'm afraid that more will leave. And I'm afraid actually for the future of this country, if things don't turn back to normal, like Joan said, how are we going to go back to normal after this? And I'm really, really worried that we won't.
Maybe there's a new normal. Joan, talk a little bit about Jewish communal reaction.
Well, I'm not Jewish.
All the more reason to have you speak about it.
No, I just don't want to attribute views to people. I meet with a lot of community leaders and community groups, and I work with Jewish people as well. I think they feel very vulnerable, and I know I've got friends who've asked their kids to put their Star of David, either take it off or put it inside their shirt, not to wear it at school. My grandchildren are students who want to be balanced or fair or support Israel or speak up for Israel are frightened of doing so on campus. It's absolutely impossible on campus for young people, and therefore for Jewish students it must be positively unbearable. I would say it's wicked, really. It is really wicked. Colin said about the marches in London. A lot of people, but particularly I think Jewish community, feel it's a no-go area on a day of these marches. They're usually on a Saturday. I have actually been down there, not on the march, but just travelling through, and it is unnerving, extremely unnerving. And it's lots and lots of young people. And I just think BDS has really done a job on the campuses of poisoning the hearts and minds of young people against Israel and against the Jewish community, because I think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I think it's utterly shocking.
Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism connected to the BDS movement, all part of the delegitimation of the state of Israel.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's so wrong. And when I say I'm not Jewish, that doesn't mean I haven't got a vested interest in this. I'm involved in this because of my values and principles in the kind of work I do. But also, I want to live in a decent society, and I want my kids and grandkids to live in one as well. I want it to be fair and decent and respectful, and everybody to feel valued. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. When we say we've got strategic interests, the first and biggest interest we've got is all of the defence for all of us across Western Europe and Israel. And Ukraine tells us that we're not as secure as we thought we were in Western Europe, and that we have this interest because on the opposite side to that is Iran and Russia and China. And we should be worried about that. And the axis of resistance, all Iran's proxies and Assad in Syria. These are a threat not just to Israel. Israel is a front line, but they're a threat to us as well. If we want to protect living in a democracy and the values that we're all signed up to, then we're going to have to accept it's more fragile than we thought, and we're going to have to stand up and speak out.
The Jewish community here is about 300,000. And I live in northwest London, which is probably the greatest concentration of Jews in a particular area in Europe. So it's different here. For example, I go and pick up my grandchildren occasionally from school. There are not problems. They go to Jewish schools. I think people are not terrified, but they take care. They are wary of what could be. There's no overt violence, but there could be. I went last night with my wife. We did the Pesach shopping in Golders Green, and I noticed there's a guy standing outside as a guard. So that wasn't there last year. So there's this sort of thing. For Jews going into central London on a Saturday afternoon, I don't think it's a no-go area, because there was a small pro-Israel demonstration. They were holding flags a couple of weeks ago. But clearly, it's not wise to go there if you're sporting a big Star of David across your chest, and you have to take reality into account. This is what I'm saying. Doesn't mean that Jews are terrified. It means that they take note of the reality. Indeed, I keep Shabbat. So if I didn't keep Shabbat, I would go down just to observe what these pro-Palestinian marches are all about, for my own interest, to understand what these people are really, really about. I would agree that it's terrible for Jewish students who are in the middle of all of this. What I wanted to say actually is that where I am, which is a concentration of Jews in northwest London, you don't see too much of this. But I think that in places like Leeds, for example, the rabbi there had served in the IDF, they pick on these people. So in outlying provincial communities, that's where the problem lies. That doesn't mean that in this area of London it won't happen here, but at the moment it's okay. I taught the Israel-Palestine conflict at the University of London for a decade or more. I never experienced any anti-Semitism. They certainly didn't think Israel was the flavor of the month, that's certainly. But I think after 2 terms, they began to see that the situation was complex and not simple. It was not right and wrong. It was not yes and no, not black and white. One of my students, who wrote excellent essays on Jabotinsky, and she's of Palestinian origin, she's an ambassador at the UN for one of the Arab states. And she wrote to me after the 7th of October to say how disgusted, how terrible it was, as her teacher. But what I found with students is that when they came to SOAS, and I'm talking about 20 years ago, they were shell-shocked, because a lot of the students who come to SOAS come from the Arab world, come from the Islamic world, come from the developing world. So as soon as they get off the plane, quite often their views on Israel are set in concrete. But a lot of these Jewish students came to me actually after a few weeks to take my courses because they were shell-shocked. And it was a rite of passage for them. By the end of the third year, by the end of their degree, they began to have educated themselves about Jewish history, about Israeli history, about Zionism. And they could answer back. I think it's far worse today. If I was teaching, I'm sure it would be far worse today. But I think the rule still applies. It's a rite of passage. It shocks people into educating themselves about who they are as Jews.
I do think education is the key to how we're going to find the way back. I don't mean the political solution. We're
Yes.
not going to be in those final status talks. I think you must have done fabulous work, Colin, because it is education, isn't it? If we don't believe we can educate people, we're going to have to give up. How can we give up on this? We educate in a different way in ELNET. Something like almost 80% of the US Congress has actually visited Israel, whereas it's something like 10% of European legislators. It's a massive gap. So we take delegations, we set up strategic dialogues right across European policymakers and legislators. We're not a grassroots organisation, but nothing has the impact like taking people to Israel. We've taken nearly 300 members of parliament across Europe since October the 7th. We set up solidarity missions and nobody got hurt. Very careful with people. But we went to Kfar Aza and to the Nova site and to Sderot, and we've seen all these places. And one of the things that has shocked me most has been the denial of the sexual violence against women. Now, I know this happens in all wars. Rape is a weapon of war. But the idea of denying that it happened when we know it's still happening every day to hostages, however many, God knows, are still alive, I think that has been really quite unbelievably shocking. I worry that we're in danger of not being shocked at some of these terrible things. It was almost a relief, the reaction across Europe and America on October the 7th, but there's been such a PR propaganda onslaught from Hamas and around the world media who've taken their line that I just think we're beginning to not be shocked by it and to even deny it happened. It's an obscenity, really.
Tell us about the experience with schools and the audiences, the kind of questions you've been asked, and the kind of education that's lacking.
First of all, the most important thing to note here is that Holocaust education is not mandatory in the Netherlands, which is absurd. A lot of people don't know that from all Western European countries, the Jews in the Netherlands, percentage-wise, were the highest rate of deported and gassed Jews, over 70%. A lot of Dutch people still think that the Netherlands was a pure resistance country during the World War, but that is a fairy tale that really doesn't exist, with all the respect to those who stood up. In schools, things have been very hard. Also on campuses, I've been very occupied with the problems at universities since the 7th of October. And we see a lot of activity from organizations, all connected somewhat, somehow to BDS, Students for Justice for Palestine. I imagine that in the States and in the UK, it will be something similar. These groups have been very, very active and aggressive towards Jewish students and also non-Jewish students, maybe Christians that are Zionists and they speak out for Israel. They've been very aggressive. And the main problem here is that the management of the universities deliberately and structurally chooses to look away. They structurally choose not to protect and stand for their Jewish students and Jewish personnel. And this is maybe even the biggest problem, because anti-Semitism already exists for thousands of years. I do not have any illusion that it will change in the future. So we will always have anti-Semites. But to see that people of stature, knowledgeable people, people of education who are in high positions in universities do not stand up for Jewish students and their personnel, it is very hurtful to see. So I think this is a huge problem, also strengthened by the fact that a lot of teachers at universities are part of Scholars for Palestine. So they organize lecture weeks on different topics, but every topic is related to some form of resistance towards Israel or in some way to demonize the Jewish state. And a lot of people actually visit these lectures. So the idea that these students get from those lectures is, of course, that Israel is the cruel demonizer and is occupying, and the only indigenous people are the Palestinians. And that is a very distorted image. I do this a lot. I go to schools, I also go to universities. I speak a lot about Israel. I give a lot of lectures, and I also give a lot of talks about my own experience in the IDF. And I think that is a very powerful tool, not only because I was an IDF officer, so I have a picture, an idea of what is happening, also because I am the son of a Jewish father and a Muslim mother. And that gives me the opportunity also to connect with a lot of people within the Islamic society here in the Netherlands, also with Islamic students, but also in the far left. They see me as kind of an anomaly within the Zionist movement, but I can build bridges through that, and I will keep doing that. But the situation for the generations that are coming is very worrisome, which already before the 7th of October was shown by a research from the Claims Conference, who actually showed that 25% of Dutch people below the age of 40 either did not know what the Holocaust was, thought that the 6 million was an exaggeration, or that it did happen, but wasn't that interesting for them. We're talking about 25% of the people below 40. It's huge. So I think we have to push on education, and we are very much pushing and pushing and pushing Dutch government and parliament to bring back Holocaust education in the curriculum so that it is mandatory for all. And also, we just had the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam, which caused a lot of trouble because of demonstrations. But we also urged the Dutch government to make the Holocaust Museum mandatory for every school, and that at least a Dutch person for once in his life can visit the museum for free. Because I agree with Joan when you say the education is key. But I would add to it that we need to have measures that are also preventive and also repressive. Because people of 40, 50, 60 years of age, when you're a hardcore anti-Semite or a hardcore anti-Zionist, education, it's not going to do the trick from my point of view. I think we need to have a zero tolerance policy from the government, a zero tolerance policy from the police, and that we need to educate the younger generations. I was also addicted to social media when I was 18, 19, 20, but I'm very active on X, for instance. And the amount of anti-Semitic rants and blood libels and anti-Semitic myths I see there, it is horrifying. And when you are young and you are not knowledgeable, which is not a judgment, the chances that you will believe what is being said are fairly high. And we put a lot of pressure on social media platforms as well.
Joan, Colin, Raouf, thank you very much for illuminating us with your awareness, your insights. I fully concur with Joan that one of the great absences in education is that we don't teach our kids that Israel is living in the Middle East. And it's not just a matter of Israel and Hamas, it's Israel and the rest of the Middle East. And it's just geostrategic importance of the region. And we just don't seem to teach it at any level, whether it's in third grade or when kids are 14 to 15 years old. It's not the kind of Middle Eastern history and political science that was taught 25, 35, and 45 years ago. If folks are interested in supporting the Center for Israel Education, come to the site, benefit yourself intellectually, help yourself to free education. It's all non-polemical and there's no disinformation.